Okay, it's time for a little review of what we've learned about Sophocles' Greek play, Oedipus Rex. Due to its economical presentation and overall effect, Oedipus Rex is an excellent example of tragedy. The economical presentation is created because all of the play's events lead to Oedipus's realization of his horrible acts. The overall effect is devastating because we see Oedipus, the tragic figure, face his extreme suffering with courage and integrity. We'll leave ancient Greece now and move into the Middle Ages.
Section C, Tragedy in the Middle Ages.
After studying the tragedies of ancient Greece, we need to stop in the Middle Ages before making our way to Shakespeare and the English Renaissance. Let's look at the important tragic forms of the years between AD 500 and AD 1500, the time known as the Middle Ages.
These tragedies, or tragical tales, were really teaching stories rather than dramatic plays. One of the most influential of these is Boccaccio's De Casibus Rerorum Illustrium, which was written in Latin.
This book gave its name to a type of tragedy called a decasibus tragedy. A medieval decasibus tragedy has three main features.
1. These tales are in the form of narratives or stories rather than dramatic plays. 2. The fall or death of the main character, usually from a high position, was enough for the tale to be considered tragic. And 3. These tales were meant to teach the reader various lessons, for instance, humility or caution.
This form of tragedy continued into the 1500s, the most notable example in English being The Mirror for Magistrates, which was an immensely popular series of cautionary tales about the fall of famous English figures.
These narratives are warnings. They're kind of like they're telling us, you better watch it, buddy, I've got my eye on you. It was all about the Wheel of Fortune, a concept which was very popular with the Elizabethans.
The Wheel of Fortune!
You may be sailing along pretty good. Everything's fine. That's when you're at the top of the Wheel of Fortune. But it's just a matter of time before you fall, because that wheel just keeps on turning.
Whoa!
Then you're down here, at the bottom. And let me tell you, life stinks down here. Hey, Oedipus!
You know, it's a short step from the De Casibus tragedies to plays that Shakespeare wrote, like his history plays about the fall of kings, for instance, Richard II and Richard III. You know, since we've mentioned these two Shakespeare plays, let's dive in all the way and talk about what his tragedies are like.
Section D, Shakespeare and Tragedy.
To be or not to be, that is the question. But it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune.
And thou, O shaking thunder, strike flat the thick rotundity of the world, crack nature's molds, all germain spill at once that makes ingrateful man. I am a man more sinned against than sinning.
Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing.
It is the cause. It is the cause, my soul. Let me not name it to you, you chaste stars. It is the cause.
Those are some of Shakespeare's best and most famous lines. Each of them are spoken by a tragic figure in one of the playwright's major tragedies, tragedies that have remained popular and affecting for hundreds of years.
Shakespeare, as a writer of tragedy, was very influenced by the kind of storytelling found in those Middle Ages decasibus tragedies discussed earlier. Shakespeare's tragedies reflect the theme of life as a pattern controlled by fortune.
Generally speaking, Shakespeare wrote 10 tragedies.
Titus Andronicus, Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar, Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, King Lear, Antony and Cleopatra, Coriolanus, and Timon of Athens.
Let's touch briefly on 6 of these tragedies. That way we can track Shakespeare's development as a tragedian.
We'll look at Titus Andronicus, Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, and King Lear.
Titus Andronicus was the first tragedy William Shakespeare ever wrote. Written around 1590, it's actually not that great of a tragedy.
That's right, even Shakespeare wrote mediocre stuff. The play is the 16th century equivalent of a slasher horror movie. It concerns this guy, Titus Andronicus, that has a bunch of bad stuff done to him and his family by the emperor, like decapitation, rape, and mutilation.
Well, Titus gets his revenge in a gruesome way, with several stabbings and more decapitations. Pretty gruesome, eh?
At this point, Shakespeare was just starting out as a playwright, and his command of theatrical conventions and poetry was still being perfected. You know what, though? Titus Andronicus was actually quite popular in its day.
Things improve a lot by the time of Shakespeare's next tragedy, Romeo and Juliet, written about 6 years after Titus Andronicus.
The second tragedy is the very famous and much-loved story of those star-crossed lovers, Romeo and Juliet. Interestingly, Shakespeare took a plot structure, young lovers who try to overcome parental disapproval, that was more commonly found in comedies than tragedies.
And the playwright focused on the doomed love of the two main characters, rather than probing a single tragic figure's extreme suffering. For his major tragedies, Shakespeare never returned to the format he used in Romeo and Juliet. First off, the structure was straight tragedy, no comedy then tragedy setup. And he focused on just one tragic figure of mighty proportions, instead of two doomed lover types, except in Antony and Cleopatra. But Antony and Cleopatra are no Romeo and Juliet.
The next tragedy Shakespeare wrote, Hamlet, is probably the most famous tragedy ever written in the English language.
The play concerns the young Prince Hamlet, who must decide whether or not to avenge the murder of his father, the king. But Hamlet can't seem to act.
He thinks everything through, wondering about the ethical, moral, and spiritual consequences of his possible vengeance. Containing the full range of human emotions, Hamlet is a complex character in a complex play. Philosophical and cerebral, Hamlet is a thinking person's tragedy.
Othello, written around 1603, is a tragedy that rivals Sophocles' Oedipus Rex for sheer economy of plot. The emotional impact of Othello is stunning, as we follow the heartbreaking fall of a good man, destroyed by his obsessive jealousy.
Here Shakespeare really probes the suffering of his tragic figure Othello, creating a devastating effect on those who see or read the play.
The tragedy of Macbeth is much different. This play, written between 1603 and 1606, concerns the overly ambitious Scottish ruler, Macbeth, a man who destroys his soul to gain power.
Macbeth is an examination of evil from the inside. Shakespeare probes the conscience of a tragic figure who knows full well the consequences of his actions.
Macbeth can be considered Shakespeare's zenith as a writer of blank verse. The poetry in the play is extraordinary, and the characters, especially that of Macbeth, are very well drawn. All in all, it's a spooky, chilling play.
Our next play is King Lear. It was actually written before Macbeth, but many experts believe King Lear to be Shakespeare's crowning achievement in tragedy.
Sprawling, metaphoric, and poetic, this play is a grand fable, an almost fairy tale-like story of a king who exiles all those close to him, but through extreme suffering and ultimately madness, achieves redemption.
Coming after the experimentation and promise of Titus Andronicus and Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, and King Lear are the height of Shakespeare's achievement as a tragedian. Each explore a variation on the theme of the tragic figure and his suffering. These time-tested plays are truly supreme examples of that unique work of art, the tragedy.
An important style of tragedy in the Middle Ages was the Decasibus tragedy, named after the book De Casibus Virorum Illustrium by Boccaccio. These tragedies had three main features. One, they were in the form of narratives rather than dramatic plays. Two, they involved the fall of the main character, usually from a high place. And third, they taught a basic moral lesson.
The Wheel of Fortune was a popular concept during the English Renaissance, and Shakespeare made use of this concept in his plays. Characters may be at the top of the wheel, experiencing good fortune, but eventually they will fall and wind up at the bottom of the wheel, where they experience bad fortune.
Generally speaking, Shakespeare wrote 10 tragedies in his career. Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, and King Lear are considered to be among the greatest tragedies ever written.
Well, Shakespeare fans, we've come to the